So we got a 6.0 Power Stroke swap Mustang here, and it's a burnout car. They just put the motor in it and did a pretty badass burnout for like 20-30 seconds at 5,300 RPM. And at the end of the burnout, it just completely turned off, would not restart. And so they brought it back to the shop, and they went ahead and pulled this right-hand cylinder head off and was checking things out in there. They had some low compression issues and went through the head, looked it all over, couldn't really find anything, and put it all back together, and had been just trying to get this thing to start. And even on starting fluid, brake parts cleaner, it won't run. I'll try to post the video. It'll fire off just a little bit and immediately die. It's spitting and sputtering. It's got white smoke coming out the exhaust. So this is what the motor sounded like when we showed up. You can hear the difference in compression from cylinder to cylinder, which you will see later in the relative compression test. Also notice the steady popping noise coming from the intake. When I show you what we found at the end of the video, you should understand why it's making that sound. So my brother and I decided to come up here on the weekend just to try to help him out, see if we might be able to figure it out. And first thing I did is I did a relative compression test, and let me go ahead and show you there. So this is the relative compression test, and on this test we just take an amp clamp and hook it up to the starter main cable, and we can monitor the amperage of the starter and see if we got a cylinder that's lower on compression, because a cylinder that's low on compression will draw less amperage than a cylinder high on compression. So you can see here, it's all over the place. These should be completely even, and you can see these two cylinders are way lower than the others. So if you count them out, you'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, 8 are down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 are down. So we knew we needed to do a compression test on this thing. So we did a compression test, and the numbers were all over the place. Did a leak down test on it, and found some leaking valves and rings leaking and stuff like that. But I did the driver's side bank first. Then I came over here to the passenger side bank with the leak down tester. And on your leak down tester, it's got your two gauges here. You got your incoming air pressure, and then your pressure on the right gauge is the cylinder pressure. And the cylinder pressure should be 0 psi when the valves are open. And on this bank here, when the exhaust valves would open, we would still have pressure on the gauge here. And so I was like, what in the world's going on? And we noticed that in the very first one we tested. So I stuck my borescope down there, and the exhaust valves were a good half-inch open. And I put the leak down tester back on that cylinder, and with the motor in the same position, it still was building pressure in the cylinder. And repeated that test for these three cylinders, and the same thing. We had 0 air coming out the exhaust. Like, here's the exhaust. You could, even with a stethoscope, completely no air. So I knew there had to have been a restriction in the exhaust. I thought maybe they might have put a solid gasket on one of these flanges, but we unbolted the flange, and it had the right gasket in there. So look at this. So when I get that up pipe off, I'll show you better. But if I pull the bellows away, you can see there's something in there, a restriction. And it's where they welded on this EGR delete plate. There's got to be a piece of metal in there on the inside that when the EGTs got hot enough, this thing's gonna be glowing red hot, the welds came loose, something happened, and there's a piece of sheet metal in there that curled back and completely sealed it off. Being that thing was probably red hot as a tomato, it was able to get a 100% seal in there and cause that whole bank to die. And then, of course, the motor won't run after that. So I got the up pipe off. You can see it's completely sealed. And what happened is when they welded this EGR delete on here, this weld right here, it actually weakened the factory exhaust pipe here, and that's where the pipe broke on the inside. So it broke and curled away and completely blocked that off. You can see how it's curled over there, and then on the inside, if you look closely, you'll see the crack at 90 degrees here. Hard to see the crack here. But you'll see the cracks there where it peeled away. Try to get to focus here. But that's what happened, and it was so hot, you know, red hot, that it created a perfect seal. It conformed perfectly to that cylinder, or to the pipe, not the cylinder. And I was really curious to see if the pressure transducer would pick up a spike in pressure on the exhaust stroke when the pressure should be 0. So I hooked it up here, and there's really not a spike in pressure due to the fact that the engine's not running, it's just cranking, and we have a very large volume between the restriction and the exhaust valve. We have a large volume of air that would have to be compressed to actually show a rise in pressure, and that's just not really possible when you're just cranking the motor over, because any pressure that's built in the exhaust is immediately released when the exhaust valve opens on another cylinder. It reverts out the intake. And that was another thing. When you're cranking this thing, you could hear popping coming out the intake. And I thought that was mainly due to some of the valves not sealing. But the main source of the popping out the intake is due to the pressure buildup in the exhaust. And because you'd be rotating this motor over, and when the exhaust valves would open on another cylinder, you'd just hear whoosh from the reversion due to the overlap of the valves. But here's the in-cylinder pressure transducer waveform. And as you can see, we come up on top dead center, and we got our power stroke, and then we have the exhaust should open around here. There's not really, barely any pressure build at all. But being that the engine's not running, it's hard to see any type of pressure build up in the exhaust. So the leak down tester was definitely the best tool for the job in this situation. Well, now it's time to see if she'll start. We got the right hand up pipe completely removed off the manifold, and just keep in mind we did have that right hand oil rail completely removed, so it's going to take quite a bit of cranking to rebuild the ICP pressure in order to fire the injectors to get this thing started.